As I was waiting for this panel to begin, one of the wonderful young women who is directing this whole conference and making sure we all have coffee and we know where we're going asked me, she said, so you're doing the happiness stuff, and I'm just wondering, is this really new? I mean, haven't we been kind of asking these questions since Aristotle? Yes, we have, indeed, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We are not the first people to wonder about human happiness. We won't be the last. We do, however, usually act as though our questions are new questions, and though our points of view are timeless, neither of those are true. And we have today with us distinguished historian and philosopher who are going to teach us a lot about happiness, and here to help us disentangle these issues. We're going to hear first from Darren Mcmahon. Darren is the Ben Wider Professor of History at Florida State. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post. And his 2006 book, which, by the way, was published by Atlantic Monthly Books, was entitled Happiness, A History. Now, that's a pretty presumptuous title. A history of happiness? Pick it up and you will realize it lives up to its name. When I first read it, I was not only blown away by its analysis, but I thought, my God, this guy must have the most magnificent system of index cards I've ever seen. It turns out he does, and they are all between his ears. I'm also very delighted to be sharing the stage with a dear friend of mine, Sissela Bach, philosopher and ethicist, a senior visiting fellow at the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies and Harvard School of Public Health. Sissela has written several of my favorite books in philosophy, Lying, Secrets, Mayhem. And so I was rather relieved when she finally wrote a book that I could put on the coffee table without scaring the children. And her newest book is called Exploring Happiness from Aristotle to Brain Science. It's a wonderful title, and it is a wonderful book. So I'm delighted to welcome you both. Darren will speak to us for a little while first, then Sissela. We'll have a brief discussion, then open it up to all of you.
So much, Dan. You can take the professor out of the classroom, but not the classroom out of the professor. I always like to speak from a podium. This comes from years of experience that it's good to have a sort of solid object between the audience and your vital organs in case they rush the stage. So I'll do this. I want to just say, though, thank you to the Aspen Festival for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for coming, and especially thanks to the staff. I know that many of the people here who are doing such a wonderful job are working on a volunteer basis, and if you express your gratitude to them, they'll be appreciative, and we know from the research that'll actually make you happier as well. So you kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of happiness and what that history has to tell us about the present of happiness. And I'm always very careful when I use the word to articulate it clearly and to place the accent correctly. You may have heard the story. It's probably apocryphal, but historians are not above passing this sort of thing along. The story of the president of France, Charles de Gaulle, and his wife, who were dining at the end of de Gaulle's career at the house of the English Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. And during the course of the dinner, Macmillan asked Madame de Gaulle what she was most looking forward to upon her husband's retirement. Le penis, came the reply. There was an awkward pause, a little bit like this one. Macmillan was visibly flustered, and he said, well, yes, there's not much time for that sort of thing now. At which point, Monsieur le Président leaned over to explain, my dear, I believe in English the word is pronounced happiness. So this is the kind of insight that historians can offer, right? I can't resist sharing with you one other. We collect these sort of stories. This is my favorite, the great Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson's wonderful line to the effect that a man can only be happy in the past or in the future. Never in the present, asked Boswell, his faithful sidekick. Never, Johnson replied, never but when he is drunk. Right? Which brings me to my first serious point, and that is that the notion that human beings not only can be happy in the present, in the here and now, and indeed even when sober, but that they ought to be happy, and in fact that they should be happy simply by virtue of being in the world, is actually a very recent notion in historical terms. It dates roughly to the same period that Johnson was writing, the long 18th century, a period that witnesses what I describe as a revolution in the nature of human expectations, with men and women presented with the altogether novel prospect that happiness is our natural condition or state. This is the period in which the great English philosopher and revolutionary John Locke can declare that the business of man is to be happy. It's in this period that the French Encyclopédie, the Bible of the European Enlightenment, declares in its article, Happiness, that everyone has a right to be happy according to his whims. It's in this period that Thomas Jefferson, of course, observes that the pursuit of happiness is a self-evident truth, but his colleague and friend George Mason in the Virginia Declaration of Rights speaks not only of pursuing, but of obtaining happiness as a natural right. It's in this time, finally, that the French revolutionary Saint-Just can stand up during the height of the French Revolution, and indeed during a period of its greatest blood flow during the Terror in the spring of 1794, and declare that, quote, happiness is a new idea in Europe. And in many ways it was. Which is not to say that no one had ever bothered to pursue happiness prior to this time, and yet I would argue that they did so in fundamentally different ways, with different definitions and different expectations. So consider the word happiness itself. It's a striking fact that in every Indo-European language, and many others besides, the word for happiness is cognate with luck. So the root in English is hap. It's an Old Norse and Old English word, H-A-P. It gives us words like perhaps, happenstance, happy-go-lucky. It's true in French. The root of bonheur, the contemporary French term for happiness is heure. In Old French it means fortune, so bonheur means good luck or good fortune. Glück in German to this day means both happiness and luck, and we could go on and on and on. What does that suggest? Well, the short of it is that for most people at most times in human history, happiness was not something that one could expect to control. It was in the hands of the gods, it was dictated by fate or fortune, it was controlled by the stars, but ordinary people, people like you and I, couldn't count on making it for ourselves. Happiness literally was what happened to us, and so to be happy was to be lucky. And even those who are lucky right now would do well to expect a turn for the worse. Now, this was a deep and pervasive way of thinking about the world, although there were certainly those who challenged it, those who refused to submit passively to fate or simply to accept the hap of hap. The entire Greek and Roman ethical tradition, for example, beginning with Socrates, is in many respects an extended reflection on how one might triumph over circumstances despite the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, achieving happiness, or what the Greeks call eudaimonia, a full, flourishing, and complete life. The same is true in many other traditions as well. Some of you, I hope, had the pleasure either today or yesterday to hear Mathieu Ricard speak about happiness, and if you did, you'll know that that Buddhism, like many, if not all, of the world's major religious traditions, is in many ways a technology for achieving happiness. It's true that the first of the Four Noble Truths is a little bit hard. Right? All life is suffering, is the point of departure. But the good news is that enlightenment is a way out of that suffering. The point, though, that I would stress is that in early Buddhism, as in other major wisdom traditions, happiness is thought of as an exception, right? And suffering the norm or default. Happiness, in other words, is an extraordinary state. It's, as Mathieu said yesterday, something we have to work at, to practice, to attain. It's a reward, a prize, something to be earned or won for rare virtue, exceptional conduct, or superior knowledge. It's what accrues to those who manage to somehow overcome normal human conditions. And the sad fact is that most people simply aren't up to the task. The happy, says Aristotle, are the happy few. In the Jewish or Christian traditions, such people would be described as blessed, right? Those special ones who are singled out for divine favor or grace, which liberates the chosen from the veil of tears, which is so often this life. On this view, human beings might have been perfectly happy in the past, in the Garden of Eden, say, or some primordial golden age, and they might hope to be happy in the future, the millennium, or with the second coming, or when the children of Israel are fully redeemed in the promised land, which lies on the horizon next year in Jerusalem. Happiness in the here and now, however, in the normal conditions of life, wasn't considered an earthly prospect for the great majority, who spent their time simply struggling to stay alive. And that, in large part, was Samuel Johnson's point. And that, in large part, is the basic assumption that gets challenged in the late 17th and 18th centuries. It's challenged for a whole variety of reasons: changing religious conceptions, new attitudes towards pleasure, economic transformations, a greater sense of the mastery of the unknown, all reasons which are interesting in their own right, but that result collectively in giving ever greater numbers of human beings the confidence that they could control their fate and that they needn't have to suffer by some sinister and perverse law of the universe. happiness in the here and now was a realistic and worthy goal for more than a happy few. Now this was, it need hardly be said, a gradual process and an imperfect one. If you were an African-American slave, say, or a peasant woman living at the threshold of subsistence, the idea that you ought just to be happy like that may have seemed something of a cruel joke. And yet, however slowly and however imperfectly, the promise, once extended, proved difficult to contain or deny. And so in the 19th century, one finds, and this is wonderfully American, one finds Americans bringing lawsuits against state and federal governments for impeding their proper pursuit of happiness, or worse, failing to provide the thing itself. In the 19th century, the Scottish man of letters already, Thomas Carlyle, is already complaining, and I quote, it would be better in a Scottish accent, or a Minnesotan perhaps, but here's Carlyle. Every pitifulest whipster that walks within a skin has had his head filled with the notion that he is, shall be, or by all human and divine laws ought to be happy. His wishes, the pitifulest whipsters, are to be fulfilled for him. His days, the pitifulest whipsters, are to flow on an ever-gentle current of enjoyment, impossible even for the gods. The prophets preach to us, thou shalt be happy, thou shalt love pleasant things and find them. And the people clamor, why have we not found pleasant things? Well, Carlyle was admittedly cynical and cranky and in many ways a distasteful individual. And yet such people can be insightful at times, and his comments here hint at several points that are still worth thinking about as we try to make sense of the history of happiness on the present. The first has to do with the sentimental or emotional consequences of the revolution in human expectations that I've just described. And I should say up front, and I strongly believe this to be the case, that this revolution was liberating by and large. When Locke declares at the end of the 17th century that, quote, the business of man is to be happy, he meant that we shouldn't have to assume that suffering is our natural lot, and that we shouldn't have to apologize for our pleasures here on earth. On the contrary, we should work to increase them. Right? It wasn't a sin to enjoy our bodies. It wasn't gluttony and greed to improve our standards of living. It wasn't a sign of luxury and depravity to pursue pleasure, and it wasn't a sign of weakness, finally, to alleviate pain. In fact, we should work to maximize the one and minimize the other, yielding the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Those are powerful injunctions. They prompted people to demand more of life, and I would argue that they stand behind many of our most humane and cherished assumptions to this day. And yet what I think Carlyle and others like him also sensed is that this new belief in the possibility of human happiness carried with it a tremendous burden. For if you think about it for a moment, to live in a world in which happiness is not considered likely or possible, a world in which suffering is the norm, and happiness a saintly or heroic achievement, this has the redeeming feature of taking some of the pressure off. You don't have to feel entirely responsible for how you feel. And while that has problems of its own, to be sure, it does provide a certain consolation. Now think about how different that perspective is from the one brought into being in the 18th century. If you can be happy, and you should be happy, and indeed if that's how human beings are naturally supposed to be, what if you're not happy? Right? Does that mean that there's something wrong with you? That you're ill or sick? That you failed? Or that others have somehow failed you, preventing you from living as you should? I think we live with a good deal of precisely this kind of guilt and resentment today. I call it the unhappiness of not being happy, and it's a particularly modern affliction. So that's one lesson to take on board. The other is closely related. Carlyle hints at it, but it was actually his contemporary Alexis de Tocqueville who put it best when he remarked in his Democracy in America on what he described as the strange melancholy that seemed to haunt Americans in the midst of their otherwise enviable freedom and prosperity. No one could work harder to be happy, Tocqueville writes, and yet a cloud habitually hung on their brow. In other words, Tocqueville is suggesting that there's a paradox at play, a paradox of pursuit, whereby an explicit focus on happiness has the potential, at least, to be counterproductive. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that that's actually the case, and I think in any event, psychologists like Dan are probably in a better position to answer the question than historians. And yet there are nonetheless enough examples, historical examples, of well-intentioned schemes for human happiness going awry to suggest to us the need for a bit of caution when we think about how we as a society ought best to go about promoting happiness at large. There's a good deal of discussion today, and I think very healthy discussion, about the need to put happiness more directly at the forefront of contemporary political and economic concerns. And while I'm sympathetic to that discussion in many ways, I would just briefly point out as a historian that it's not as if happiness hasn't already had a central place in the Western political discussion, above all since the 18th century. It was Joseph Priestley, the English utilitarian and a friend of Jefferson, who spends the end of his life in the United States, who declared that, quote, happiness is in truth the only object of legislation of intrinsic value. John Adams was even more explicit, observing, all speculative politicians would agree that happiness is the end of government. They were far from alone in thinking that way, and indeed an inevitable consequence of the revolution in human expectations that I've been describing was to make happiness a political problem. If happiness is natural, and we're entitled to it as human beings, and we're not happy, then that immediately begs the question of why. Who or what stands in the way? American and French revolutionaries posed that question directly in the 18th century, and I think it's clear that the major political traditions since that time, whether republicanism, liberalism, or utilitarianism, socialism, or communism, did so as well, and not always, as we know, with happy results. Now, one can, of course, argue rightly that our metrics are much better today. We have a more sophisticated sense of the mechanics of mood, of the causes and correlates of positive affect and subjective well-being. One can also argue that we'd be foolish not to bring this knowledge to bear when it can be appropriately applied to contemporary social, political, and economic questions, and I entirely agree. And yet I think we also want to be somewhat cautious in our implementations, recognizing at once the incredibly seductive appeal of happiness, for who amongst us doesn't want to be happy? And most of us have a slightly different notion of what happiness entails, as well as sensitive to the ways in which the great goal of happiness has tended to crowd out all others since the 18th century, so that it can seem at times that we have our sights trained now on nothing else. John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher and friend of both Tocqueville and Carlyle, a man who spent his entire life thinking about ways to promote human happiness, once observed in the context of his own life, ask yourself whether you are happy and you cease to be so. Again, whether that is really true or not is not clear, at least not to me, but given how much time we spend asking ourselves that very same question today, I think it's well worth pondering.
Thank you, Darren. Sissela.
Well, I am so glad to be here, not least because I'm part of this happiness track that Dan has inspired. And while I was writing my book, Exploring Happiness, I was reading the books by so many of the people in this happiness track, little expecting that I would actually meet them. One of the aims of my book, Exploring Happiness, was to explore all the different views, often conflicting, about what happiness is and how one might achieve it, religious, political, personal, so many other different views, and so many visions and so many human experiences. And so my aim was to try to explore and not at all tell people how they should become happier, not at all tell people that I had a particular doctrine about it, but simply to find out what's been done. And one of the great things I found was, or knew really, that for the past 30 years, extraordinary kinds of research have been conducted by psychologists, social scientists, brain scientists, and others. And I wanted to bring that kind of research into conversation. I did not find that it was often in conversation with the historians, the poets, the philosophers, the theologians, and people who wrote their autobiography, just so much material that is often left out of the scientific discussion at the same time as those people, especially perhaps unfortunately the philosophers, completely, I think, very often leave out all that's now been done in the last 30 years. So I wanted to bring those different traditions and all the resources together into conversation if I could. And that's why I'm so happy to be here. And very grateful also to Darrin and to Dan for their books, which I certainly studied, and indeed happened, sort of shifted back and forth with my husband, who was also writing a book about happiness. But my second aim that I'm going to concentrate on today was to examine the views of happiness that exist, all those different views, by asking about the connections that they see between happiness and morality. You could call it happiness and virtue. And namely, how we treat other people and ourselves, how we deal with other human beings, and what link that might have with different views of happiness. And I suggested early in my book that whenever somebody comes and tells you this is how you should get happy, this is what you should do, these are all the steps you should take, you yourself should ask what I call yes, but questions. Sometimes empirical, yes, but what's the evidence that you have? Sometimes they do indeed. Sometimes moral questions, yes, but what does pursuing my happiness along your lines mean to what other people are doing? Am I, for instance, might I have to tell lies in order to pursue happiness in this way? Or be cruel? Or break the law? Another yes but question is, what kind of person do I really want to be while pursuing happiness? And then what might I owe to other people, even if that means that I have to sacrifice my personal happiness? Well, I'm going to begin discussing this with you by bringing in a quotation from a movie that a number of you may have seen. It's one of my favorites, Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander. Has anybody, do you know it? Yeah. And it's very complicated. Much happiness and unhappiness goes on in that film. I could spend my whole time talking about that. I won't. But it is a film that the story takes place historically in a way, 100 years ago, as the First World War, the nations were gearing up to fight it. And there was a family in Uppsala, in Sweden, a theatrical family that owned a theater. And as I say, many, many things happened. Deaths happened, births happened. And the quotation that I want to use here, just to begin our discussion, is from Uncle Gustav. There is a christening of 2 babies. One of the babies is actually his, had not exactly with his own wife, but he had gathered, yeah, not exactly, yes. He had gathered, everybody was gathered together, and they were happy. There was a celebration in what the Swedes call the time of lilacs. And these 2 little baby girls were lying in their beautifully decorated little cradles. And Uncle Gustav, bringing in also the fact that they, of course, will die in the long run, as all the other people around the table will do sooner, he said, "The world is a den of thieves, and night is falling. Evil is breaking its chains and goes through the world like a mad dog. Therefore, let us be happy while we are happy. Let us be kind, generous, affectionate, and good. Therefore, it is necessary and not in the least shameful to take pleasure in this little world. Good food, gentle smiles, fruit trees in bloom, waltzes." Now, this is also Ingmar Bergman's, to some extent, autobiographical movie. He himself was the young boy Alexander in the film. Well, I think to me, this quote is always very moving when I read it and when I see the film. And we can absolutely all understand a family pulling together, people, family and friends, and they're pulling together and they're saying the world out there is terrible, often. And we are threatened, and we ourselves will die. But meanwhile, let us be happy, and let us be good to one another. Let us be gentle and kind human beings. And I think that effort to distinguish between the big world and the little world, the one world we know in our personal lives, is very important. There are vast problems in the world we know that we can't do much about in a personal way. So the distinction often makes sense. And still, those yes, but questions have to come in. And I'm now not asking that to Uncle Gustav, but I'm really just using the quotation. What if the happiness or well-being or even just survival of people in the little world is bought at the cost of activities that increase suffering for others? Think, for example, right now, of the banking and mortgage practices that have wrought such misery for so many people here and abroad, yet enriched those people most responsible and their families, their little worlds. What if fraud, injustice, lying, promise breaking went on by the individuals who thereby have increased the happiness of their little world? What should we think about that? And what should we think about all the individuals involved in the manufacture, the distribution, and the selling of products that they know are dangerous, perhaps even lethal to consumers? I remember Buckminster Fuller, who was here, of course, at the Aspen Institute, and his geodesic dome, by the way, was just taken apart, I noticed out my window. I'm sure it will be put somewhere else. Anyway, he said that if you go into a supermarket, the majority of the things you see there are either useless or dangerous. And he just wants you to think about that as you go in. Or another case, think of the supposed happiness we see on television programs and in movies within at least some families in criminal organizations such as the mafia. So that the idea of splitting up the bigger world and then that little world that we should protect and where we can be kind within the world is problematic. In each case, the family members may indeed in the little world be thriving, insulated from the damage that is done by some members in the outside world. Another way in which the separation between the big and the little worlds becomes problematic is when there's a conflict within a family about whether or not somebody should do something in the outside world that involves great risk. And for instance, right now, as we see what's happening, has happened in Tunisia and in Egypt, what's happening right now in Syria, we have to realize that the individuals who are out there protesting, young men, young women, sometimes middle-aged, sometimes older, are often doing so in conflict with their own family members who might say, don't do this, think of our family. Look at the bright side. Be optimistic. Forget about all the troubles around you. Just focus on family and friends. That's where happiness lies. Yet, those sons and daughters who are going out, they're saying, we're doing this for the sake of happiness. And so in cases like this, happiness is really at issue on both sides. And in the great many conflicts of this nature that we now see in so many societies, that is the case. Happiness is at issue on both sides. And moral questions, of course, are at the forefront again. How does my pursuit of happiness relate to that of others? This becomes more complicated now that we're thinking of the family and others, possibly future people. What kind of a person do I want to be while pursuing happiness? What might I owe to other people, even if that means I undergo suffering or place myself at risk? A second set of moral questions comes up, again thinking of that quotation from Uncle Gustav about being happy and being kind, generous, affectionate, and good. Because it's natural to think that happiness and goodness go together. Many books on happiness, and especially self-help books that offer advice about how you should become happier, say little, in fact, about these moral questions. And why? Because they take for granted, of course, if you get to be happier our way, you're going to also be a better human being. So we don't have to worry about moral questions too much. Or else they might have the reverse idea. If you strive to be a good human being, you will be happier. That's all. Not too much reason to worry about the moral questions then either. And these two are linked to the ancient tradition from Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics, and others, where indeed individuals, thinkers said, either you will be happier if you are a good, virtuous human being, or you will be good and virtuous if you are happy. So all we need to do, however, is to look around and to see quite a few people who are often very, very good human beings, but not particularly happy. Or to see people who unfortunately are scoundrels and thieves and those mad dogs that Ingmar Bergman talked about, who seem to be happy. This is very problematic. Now, one answer to that is to say, well, they're not really happy. And that, again, is a very ancient debate. What is real happiness? If a scoundrel looks happy, is he really happy, or she? Well, then the 18th century philosopher, Immanuel Kant, brought about what some people have called the dethronement of this view that happiness and goodness are linked. He argued that happiness is something that we all naturally seek, whether or not we do what's right by ourselves and others. But he says what matters is whether we can think we are worthy of happiness, and that's what should decide our choices. Sometimes we're going to have to choose to do something that is not going to make us happy at all, but we should do it if we think that makes us more worthy of happiness. So again, those moral questions come back in. And it's interesting to me to consider how those questions could affect the responses to the psychological surveys that people are doing now all over the world. What if you ask people, how satisfied, all things considered, are you with your life? This is a very common question. Well, the people who go along with Kant's view, if they are happy, if they do think they are, if they're happy with their lives, if they think they're worthy of happiness, however unhappy they might be, they might say yes, and so might someone who, for instance, goes by the motto, looking out for number one, he might say, yes, I'm very happy, but it might have nothing to do with morality. Now, how much time do I have left, Dan? Because I'd
take as long as
well,
you like.
no. How much have time? A minute?
No, about 5 minutes, sure.
Okay,
Sure,
5 minutes
yes.
I can deal with. So I want to move on, since this is about history in part, even though I thought Ingmar Bergman's movie is history in its own right, and the movie is about history. But I want to move on to an example 2 millennia ago, in a poem by the Roman poet Horace, who wrote very briefly about the Greek merchant Lycus, who lived on an island. He was quite well-to-do, and everything was going pretty well in his life, but he had a very strange idea. He had a delusion. Namely, he had constructed a kind of an amphitheater, sort of going up the hill every morning, an amphitheater to which he walked and where he saw Greek tragedies and comedies performed. It's only that they were not being performed. He had this illusion or delusion. So he would go off, and his family members were really very upset. They thought, so this is crazy. What do we do about this? Either we become so-called enablers, now that's not their word, of course, namely we, oh yes, we're going off, how nice, you're going to see all your plays, or we try to interfere, which is what they did. And they tried and tried and tried, and nothing worked until a dose of so-called hellebore, which is a sort of medication, very strong. He took it, maybe was forced to take it, and it shook him out of his delusion. And he was miserable. And he said, he cried out in despair, and he said, "You call it rescue, my friends, but what you have done is murder me. You have destroyed my delight and forcibly swept away from my mind the most gloriously sweet of illusions." Well, this is an extreme example. We all know more everyday examples of illusions that we all have. Bertrand Russell wrote, which quote I love, "Every man, wherever he goes, is encompassed by a cloud of comforting convictions, which move with him like flies on a summer day." Well, this is also sometimes called the Lake Wobegon effect in Garrison Keillor's radio programs, where all the women are strong and all the children are above average. Well, we know that kind of thing, and we realize that we all live with a number of illusions. I think we should try to cut them back a bit, but we can never cut them away altogether. But the perplexity comes then with people who seem to live in illusion. It could be in one's family. It could be in an organization. At times, alas, it can be in the government, even on the part of heads of state. So the question then is, when and under what circumstances can it be right for outsiders to intervene? And of course, we know about interventions, for instance, with respect to alcoholism and all kinds of substance abuse. But more generally, the discussion about the rights of doing something go on now very sharply, for instance, within psychiatry and within psychology. And as with the other examples that I've mentioned, asking the question is only the beginning. Then you really have to sort through the moral factors, the moral answers that you might want to give. So this is something that I think if one just begins to think about happiness, that there are those moral yes but questions, also the empirical. So now I finally just want to go to the 18th century again and to go to France, where Darrin, of course, has already spoken. And in the Enlightenment period, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with the wonderful Kenneth Clark television series called Civilization. Well, he called that period and the whole 18th century, he called it the age of happiness, when sculpture, architecture, so much blossomed forth, also literature. But I wanted just to mention the year 1767. And the Abbé Pluquet, he was chair of moral philosophy in the Collège de France. He published a book on sociability that is still actually called one of the forerunners of all of sociology. But he was praising the new collaboration that he saw among scientists, philosophers like Diderot and others, theologians, and others who might bring about what he called a science of happiness. And right now, we have a number of books called Science of Happiness. They all actually often disagree about how they define it and what the science is. But nevertheless, I wish I could bring back the Abbé Pluquet right back to the happiness track here at Aspen, to explore with all of us a 20th century version of such a science of happiness. It would be one that would seek out areas where natural and social scientists and humanists could work together, find points of convergence, and also find challenges to various inadequate or superficial conclusions. I think we're only at the beginning of learning so much more about happiness in research in the natural and social sciences, but there is also a greater risk, I believe, and I wonder what Darrin thinks, of losing touch with the rich resources from the past. Well, I expressed the hope for a truly interdisciplinary approach to the study of happiness in my book, and this is yet another reason why I am so happy to be taking part in this happiness track here at Aspen. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Let's chat just for a few minutes before we invite everyone else to chat with us. I have to say that when I hear philosophers talk about happiness, I find myself constantly coming back to one issue that as a person I understand and as a scientist I just can't get my head around. And that's the distinction between real, true, authentic happiness and what? Unreal, false, inauthentic happiness. I kind of know what philosophers are talking about, but as a scientist, when I measure happiness, it all looks authentic to me. I mean, if a patient came in and said, without a leg, and said, you know, I'm having phantom leg pain, I wouldn't say, it's not real pain. Yes, it's real pain, it's not really from your leg, but the pain is real. If somebody feels it, it is real pain. Isn't that true of happiness? If you're feeling happy, it's real happiness. Now, you may have gotten it by doing good things, you may have gotten it by murdering people, but the happiness itself is equally real, is it not?
I would agree with you, but I agree, among philosophers there's a real debate about that, and there has been from the beginning of time. And so there I feel now that we can do so much more measuring, there has to be an argument on the part of the people who say that it's not real. However, they can define it some other way and to say it's not real because it is not located within, for instance, a doctrine or something else. But I agree with you though. Yeah.
Darrin, is it a new idea? This distinction between real and false happiness?
No, that's not a new idea. In fact, it's an old one. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. And in fact, that distinction would have been maintained, I think, by most people, at least in the Western tradition, until relatively recently. But when you pose that very question, you betray your modern bias. And that is the assumption that the first definition of happiness is feeling. A effectively, right? And so if somebody's feeling happy, they can't be wrong, right? Our feelings are the kind of the test case of authenticity. But if you pose the question slightly differently, and I think this is one of the ways in which contemporary social scientists often slide between different definitions of happiness, right? So we talk about happiness, and this is something I didn't mention in my own talk, but really in the 18th century there's a shift away from this older connection between happiness and virtue towards thinking about happiness as good feeling. And I think by and large that's our first default definition today. When you ask somebody if you're happy, you say, well, yeah, it puts a smile on my face, that's how I feel. But that's a relatively recent notion, but we also still use the term in older ways, right? We talk about, well, I'm happy with my job right now, or I'm happy with my marriage, okay, as a kind of longer term. And then we also use the term still to talk about life evaluations, right? I'm happy with my life, I'm satisfied with my life as a whole. And I think there's a tendency to slide between the two. Now, if you pose the question that you just posed, Dan, in a slightly different way, say as a cognitive therapist, and you said, well, are you happy right now? No, I'm not happy because my career is a failure and I've never done anything good in my life. And you would say gently, well, that's not true. You've done X, Y, and Z, and you're misled, right? Justifying the feeling is real, but the evaluation of the life may be inauthentic or unreal. And I think that would be one way in which you could sort of play with that distinction.
There certainly are many meanings of the word happiness, and a great deal of the argument about happiness would disappear if we would have 6 words instead of one to cover 6 things.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Let me just open up to anybody who wants to join the discussion by asking questions. The room is small enough that you don't need to be mic'd, but please state your question as loudly as possible because this is being recorded. Sir.
So I have 2 questions. From the little philosophy and theology I've read, I've inferred that real happiness is a state of being. I've inferred that real happiness is a state of being. Does this mean that happiness is a destination with a facility of permanent accommodation for the average person? Or do you find real happiness, then you lose it, then you find it, then you lose it all through your life?
Well, you say real happiness is a state of being. It could be a momentary state of being, it could be a longer one, and there I think philosophers have disagreed on that, but I would say there that, for instance, Daniel Kahneman and others have made a distinction, and you don't have to say it's just one kind. Sometimes people have a moment of happiness, sometimes it's longer, sometimes it can be a much longer state, and those are distinctions that we can live with, I think.
Okay. The second question was, is happiness an absolute? That is, if happiness is a natural state for all humanity, are there factors that make happiness universal in the sense that what makes you happy is what makes the next person happy, and that's what makes me happy? Or we have different things that make us happy, but we still get to the end destination through whatever avenue or whatever we use.
Can you just rephrase that slightly? I wasn't sure if I entirely followed you.
In essence, is what makes you happy, what makes me happy, because happiness is a natural state for all humanity. From one of the quotes you read from the philosophers in the 18th or 17th centuries.
Well, I suspect that what you makes you happy and what makes me happy are different. Although, we probably both like back rubs, and we can think of other things. I think there's been a dream, right, since the ancient world, that we could come to some kind of absolute agreement on what it is that makes a happy life. And at some level, this is what scientists of happiness today are trying to sort out, right? What are the common correlates of happiness? And we know certain things, right? We know that people who are happy, and now I'm speaking on secondhand knowledge, not as a historian, but from what I've read on the psychology, that people who are happy, that tend to have rich social networks, right? So having friends and having support correlates strongly with happiness. Having a sense of purpose or meaning in your life correlates strongly with happiness. And one could go on the list. And I think this is a way in which people can sort of agree on that there is common ground, while still being open to I think that the fact that what makes me happy may in fact make you miserable, and that's okay.
You want to chime in, Sissela? Thoughts?
Well, I think that, I guess, here I come with my yes but questions again, because the notion, for example, of the social networks There are people who are very happy being quite solitary and alone. There are so many differences, and this is one thing I tried to look for in my book. And as I studied, so many human differences. There are the solitary individuals, there are the gregarious ones, there are the ones who are happy sometimes, but not other times. There are the ones who are much more permanently on a higher level. There are the ones who are happy when they take great risks, such as mountain climbing. Other people, not at all. So there are so many differences of temperament that it's very hard to say that there's one factor. It's true, you're right to say there are factors that correlate more, but it's very important to also always to recognize there are all these individual exceptions.
From the point of view of psychology, I would have to say I completely disagree with both of them.
Go ahead.
If a Martian knew everything about what made you happy, that Martian would know a lot about everyone else. That human beings vastly overestimate these differences. You like strawberry ice cream, I like chocolate ice cream. Both of us like it more than gallbladder surgery or a hit in the head with a 2x4. And we're going to take all the things that could happen to a human being and each of us arrange them into piles of like and dislike, we'd have 99% overlap. I think we're quite impressed by the differences because they're so interesting to us. But I think by and large, human beings see the world in remarkably different ways, but they feel the world very similarly, as well they should, given that the parts of their brain from which feelings are generated are really quite ancient, not only shared with all human beings, but shared with all mammals. Wait, am I on this panel or am I moderating? Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay, I disagree.
Carol, I think you had the next question.
Carol Graham, I confess to being an insider and a columnist at Words on Happiness, but I wanted to just chime in on this definitional issue, not so much a question, but just a comment where I think a lot of really exciting research is going on now, where people are distinguishing between experienced well-being, sort of daily experiences that Sissela was referring to, momentary happiness, and then sort of life evaluation, life purpose happiness, and looking at how those two dimensions correlate differently with variables of interest like income and all kinds of other things. And I think we're starting to get a handle, at least on the different dimensions of well-being, in the sense that if you can care about one or the other, and people, it's a normative choice which one you care about. I'm certainly finding that evaluating well-being, how people evaluate their life purpose, seems to correlate more with outcomes in terms of labor productivity and better health and other things, and daily experience tends to be more of people just, enjoy their daily lives. And again, if you want to think about which one is more important, that's a big normative discussion that I'll leave to the philosophers. But we do have an enormous amount of new data on this.
Thank you. I mean, I completely agree. And yet I would still point out that, I think this is partly a linguistic problem, that we have this word, this kind of abstract signifier, happiness, that we use in radically different ways. And despite the kind of careful efforts of social scientists to distinguish, there's a tendency to conflate them, and I think in ordinary language there's a tendency. And so when we talk about happiness, we're often talking about very different things. And so it is important. And as Dan said, maybe we need 6 different words, but we're not going to get rid of happiness anytime soon. So,
great. Let me pull from this side of the room. Linda?
So there's something that sort of concerns me about the large conversation about happiness right now, which is that the question is often binary. It's, are you happy? Are you not happy? And I know for me, the only thing that works in my own life is how am I happy? Where I set myself on a path of evidence finding regardless of what's going on. So I guess I'm troubled by the nature of the larger conversation, that it's so binary, and I would love to see a world of evidence finding for what's going on.
Well, that's a very good point, that we shouldn't just think of happiness and unhappiness at all. And I do, in fact, think that much of the survey literature concerns how happy, you have all kinds of evaluations, and what are you happy about? Sometimes you can be happy about one thing, not about another. It's very important, I think, to see all of those distinctions. At the same time, the largest issue of happiness, I think we have to look at as against a background of misery. And when I wrote this book, Exploring Happiness, I was thrilled toward the very end, when the book was going to press, that it finally became possible for me to have on the cover a painting by William Turner called Sunrise and Sea Monsters, because those two things go together and one should never look at just one or the other.
Great. Sir.
I don't know if this is a fair distinction to make, but I think of what you're saying is talking about situational happiness. And I wonder if you could contrast that with what I would call genetic happiness. That is, I know some people who are just always up, always happy, built into them, it would seem. And pharmaceutical happiness. The notion is in Brave New World that you can take a pill to be happy, or when Prozac first came out, someone wrote a book in which he talked about not using that drug just to deal with depression, but to be better than well for someone who might not be depressed, but who had a higher baseline, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Well, your distinction between what you might call genetic happiness, namely the influence of genes, which psychologists have talked about a lot, and we're going to hear more, I guess, in an hour or so, in fact, with Richie Davidson. That's very important, and also what pharmaceuticals can do indeed to your emotions. Those are all important, yes. Unfortunately, on this happiness track, all these different meetings, that will be discussed, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a question for psychologists and others. I mean, you I'm sure know the literature here that would suggest that something like 50% of our aptitude for positive affect is genetically determined, and this goes all the way back to Darwin. Like so many things, Darwin writes a book on emotions and human beings and animals, and he points out that some horses are irritable and some dogs are cuddly, and I know some people who are really nice in the morning, and others, like myself, are surly in the morning, and that's just the way it is. And there's no doubt that some of this is we can't change through normal means, perhaps by pharmaceuticals, or as Mathieu was suggesting, and I think scientists are increasingly stressing now, through practice, right? Through meditation or through other techniques. Just because there's a genetic component to mood doesn't mean that we then are, we're not agents of our own lives and don't have means to determine our own ends. So. But yeah, it's a question. Come to the next session, and then they'll give you a real answer. Yeah.
Sir.
I was wondering, besides the Dalai Lama, you choose one figure in
Is
history.
a little louder for everyone? Thank you.
Besides the Dalai Lama, who's evidently very, very happy, what figure in history would you choose as your example of ideal happiness, and why?
That sounds like a great exam
Yeah.
question.
That sounds like a great exam question.
So we should repeat the question.
Yes, the question was, His Holiness the Dalai Lama appears to be a very happy individual. Excluding him, who's the person in history you would name as being ideally happy?
Now, to me, the question is so interesting because I'm not sure I would choose my ideal person that way. Namely, there are people I admire enormously, great thinkers, like, for instance, Socrates. He wasn't happy all the time, but he is a person that I would choose for many reasons. Also one who did seek happiness, however, and often experienced it. So it would be very, very hard for me to pick a person, especially in history, that I could say was sort of more or less 100% that way. And because I also think that happiness is not the main thing in life, I'm not quite sure that that's the person I would hold up.
I think it's a great question, and Dan says you should assign it, right? Who was the happiest person in the world in human history, and why? I sometimes get the question, when was the happiest age? But never thought about this. The sort of quick answer that comes immediately to mind is somebody who thought he was the happiest person in the world. In fact, I begin my book
like
with
Lucas, my
right.
example.
I begin my book with the tale of Croesus, right? And that's a name that at one point people knew. And it's funny, I was giving a talk in Tulane to a group of honor students a couple months ago, and I asked who in the room has read Herodotus' History. It's the first work of history in the Western tradition, and it's a book that a generation ago everyone who studied history read. One person in the room raised his hand, and it turned out he was a classics major. So read Herodotus' History, because it's a book of stories, and one of the first stories in the book is the tale of Croesus, who was the richest man in the world. He's a king. He's the king of Lydia, which is a Greek-speaking colony in Asia Minor in what is today Turkey. And Croesus thinks that he's the happiest person in the world. No sooner does he sort of give voice to that thought than all kinds of bad things happen to him. Right? His son is killed in a freak hunting accident. He goes to the oracle to ask if he should go to war with the invading Persian Empire, and the oracle responds, if you go to war, a great kingdom will fall. Croesus says, oh great, I'm going to war, not realizing that that kingdom was his, and so he goes to war with the Persians, then they destroy his empire, and then the story culminates with Croesus standing on this bonfire. He's being burned to death, and he cries out to the gods, call no man happy until he's dead. Right? And the moral of that story, in this kind of Greek tragic view, and Herodotus is a contemporary of the Greek tragedy, and Sophocles, and shares a kind of tragic mindset, this idea that happiness is not something we can control. The moral of the story there is that, don't think you're happy until you get through your entire life, because a piano could always fall on your head, right? And so that would be, Croesus is clearly not the happiest person, but he's, I guess, points out the danger of making that evaluation too soon.
Those were complicated answers. I would have said Harpo Marx. I mean it. Not the other brothers, but Harpo. Sir in the back.
Recognizing that the vast majority of our planet lives a subsistence income, where just getting food is what they want for the day. How much is the concept of happiness a luxury of those of us who are more fortunate on this planet?
That is a very good question. Namely, if there are so many people who are miserable from the economic point of view, is it maybe a luxury to even talk about happiness? And that came up while I was writing my book. I work with a lot of people in public health, and they said, why are you writing about happiness? Why not write about suffering, for instance? There are two answers I would give. First of all, those people, you may not know, but they have various experiences also, of, for instance, happiness with the family, much else. But secondly, happiness sometimes comes as a huge change for individuals who are sometimes miserable, and then all of a sudden, I use the expression, the quotation from Bishop Mandela, when he could finally vote, Desmond Tutu, very sorry, when he could finally vote, and the extraordinary happiness he felt. But it would be very condescending, I think, to imagine that there are huge numbers of individuals who are not happy, and therefore we shouldn't perhaps speak about the subject unless we're just talking about us who can experience happiness.
Yeah, I think I would just add that while it's true, of course, that all human beings experience moments of pleasure and displeasure and happiness and joy and so forth, and that's something that we know is universal. The smile is universal. People at all times and in all places experience this range of emotions. But I would also agree with the questioner that in some ways happiness is a luxury, and I think it's no coincidence that happiness emerges as a kind of central concern of wide numbers of people in the 18th century, at a time when some of the most pressing problems are getting solved. Not completely, but in some ways. People are understanding their world better, for one, right? So Newton comes along and says, there are laws that govern how the world is organized. We can understand those laws. We can predict. God exists, but he's not a guy who hangs out on a cloud and fires thunderbolts randomly down at us, right? We don't have to live in this kind of fear. You understand your world better. You can control it. People are getting wealthier in the 18th century, right? So that they have disposable income to spend on pleasures. People actually start talking about pursuing pleasure, pursuing happiness in the same mouthful. Wars are less common and less costly. Right? I always point out to my students that in 30 years war in the 17th century, about a third of the population of Central Europe is killed between 1618 and 1648. There are wars all throughout the 18th century, and like all wars, they're not pretty, but they're less costly than that. Famines, diseases, and so forth. And so it's only when you get those things out of the way, right, that you can afford the luxury then to not spend all day thinking about just surviving, and then thinking about, well, let's make life better, right? So Marty Seligman talked about yesterday how the default for Freud and Schopenhauer was, let's just not suffer too much, right? I think that's how most people at most times in human history have thought, let's get through the day without the piano falling on your head or without a Cossack coming in, and no offense to any Cossacks in the room, and decimating your family. But then we can go beyond that. We can think about how improving our lives, and that is a luxury, and I think it's one that we shouldn't take for granted. The very fact that we're here in Aspen having this conversation is a sign that we've gotten some of the more basic things taken care of.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Question.
Loud, please.
I have a question. You both are exploring happiness from an intellectual perspective, and I'm wondering, this is to each of you, are you happy? And is part of this intellectual exercise a personal journey toward a state of greater happiness?
That is, that's a question one is often asked, isn't that? Are we happy, we who are writing about it? Well, I would say, first of all, that it seems to me that people who write about happiness, that this is sort of an upper in a way, just as people who write about child abuse, let's say, and torture and everything can feel less happy just from the research they do. So that people who write about happiness, they have more of an opportunity to think about it. And I don't want to talk about my own state of happiness, however. I'm not really, it's sort of like, what did I vote last time or something like that, or what church might I be going to? But I do think that studying it and exploring it, looking at all the different kinds of experience really helps one, not necessarily to become happier, but to understand happiness better and to do more about one's own happiness. And there, I would say, I haven't had enough chance to say, I think, that it is indispensable to look at literature and art and autobiography and poetry in order to understand these dimensions better. And we can learn to understand the experience of happiness among other people better, just as we can learn to see better. We can use glasses, for instance, but just learn to see color, perception, so many other things better. Now, you can tell what you think about your happiness.
So I'm a Catholic, and I voted for Obama, and I'm reasonably happy. I think that when psychologists talk about set points, right, where you are, and I think my set point is probably not as high as I'd like it to be. I tend to be a little bit dour and pessimistic, but I think it's also true that people who write books about happiness, just like psychologists, a dirty secret of the profession is, a lot of psychologists are actually depressives, right? And that's one of the reasons why they go, Dan accepted, they go into the profession to, try to sort things out. And I think, personally, I started writing a book about happiness for a number of reasons, but partly because it was a quest and a pursuit of my own life. And, my standard joke was that writing a book on happiness made me miserable. But if I learned anything in the process, it was that a little bit like the moral that I suggested today from John Stuart Mill, that in some ways the best way to pursue happiness is to pursue something else. This is that psychologists will talk about flow. Flow is a kind of state of oneness and engagement that comes to you when you're doing something that you're good at and that you like, and so I get happiness other ways, not by pursuing